Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Randall Kempner. In addition to being the guy that blew the fuse earlier, sorry again about that. I am the executive director of the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs, or ANDE for short. We are a network of about 285 organizations that promote small business entrepreneurship and particularly social entrepreneurship in developing countries. The basic vision is that we think these entrepreneurs have the chance to create the millions of jobs and solve many of the social challenges that the world faces, and that they deserve a lot more resources. So philanthropic, financial, technical assistance, training, and happily lots of you in the room are members of ANDE and represent foundations, represent capacity development organizations, big development institutions like OPIC and USAID and others. And there are probably dozens of ANDE members that do something to focus on the question of supporting refugees and migrants and the entrepreneurial options to help make their lives better. And I am joined today to discuss this by Christine Mahoney, who is a professor at the University of Virginia. She has a sort of expertise in studying social justice advocacy and social innovation. She is an expert on lobbying and advocacy and studies this in a number of forms. And so we want to set the stage based in large part on Christine's book called Failure and Hope, Fighting for the Rights of the Forcibly Displaced, for what's going on in the world today as it relates to migrants and refugees and other internally displaced people. And then hopefully we'll get a little bit into what are some of the potential solutions that will then lead into the next panel. So that cool? I need some nods. All right, so good. I'm going to stick with the audience engagement question for you. And I'll ask the question, I'll give you some definitions. The question is, in how many protracted displacement crises exist in the world today? And the definition of that, of a protracted displacement crisis, means at least 10,000 people displaced for at least 5 years. So if that's the definition, how many of those do you think there are in the world today? I'm going to start calling on people, and I know enough that I can. I heard 20. Between 20 and 112. I think I got something close. 60. Someone's read the book. 65. Get that man a cigar or a drink or whatever. Is he your father? So 65 of these crises, which is a lot more than I would have expected. And then the other number, still a little audience interaction, but you can't answer. How many people does that represent? It's in the millions. I'll give you that much. All right, what Thane was saying, well, Thane can't answer. John, Simon, do you have an answer? 5 million. A little higher. Shoot higher.
25.
I heard 50 million.
25.
25, says Laurie Sping. This is it. 25. Joan's going to raise the bid. It is approximately 68 million people who are displaced either internally or externally today, which is the highest since World War II. Higher than World War II. So this is a serious, serious crisis. And so one would think that you and I and lots of other people should be massively uprising against this. Should there not be a major global advocacy campaign to try to help the 68 million people? Anyone disagree that that wouldn't be a good idea? Someone's got to disagree. Because she does. So this is the scary part. Christine, you suggest that advocacy efforts to support these migrants almost always fail. they almost always fail. So my first question to you is why?
Great. And one thing I want to focus on, what we often see, and some of the other pillars around the room, we see people advocating for healthcare, people advocating for education. And those are not very politicized topics, right? Of course, we should fight for healthcare and access to education. Unfortunately, in the case of the refugee crisis, it's become incredibly politicized. And so there's been a push to take care of those refugees. So many of you may be seeing, but I've seen campaigns to provide water, to provide shelter, to provide livelihoods we'll get to. But these basic necessities, there's many humanitarian organizations on the front lines, CRS is one of them, organizations in Caritas are another, that are trying to provide basic life-saving food and medicine. But where the advocacy's failed is advocating for these people to be able to take care of themselves and lead lives of dignity. As Randall mentioned, if you're displaced today, you'll be displaced for 26 years. So this isn't a temporary situation. This isn't something where you need a tent over your head for a few weeks or a few months. You're potentially spending decades away from your home. And unfortunately, during that time of displacement, not only have you lost everything, not only have you lost family members and been through crisis, but when you get to where you're going, you're not allowed to work. You're not allowed to take care of yourself and your family. And this is because of man-made policies. So you may have fled war, and we can't do anything about that, but when you get to that country of first asylum, you're not even allowed to start a small business or to take care of yourself and your family. And so I was interested in why has this advocacy for the right to work, the right to start a small business, the right to take care of yourself and your family failed so miserably. And so I did field work in 7 conflict zones around the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America. And what I found is in case after case, there's no one that can really effectively fight for the right to work. And I identify 5 different reasons for that in the book. The first one is that advocacy, especially for the right to work, is not the priority of the organizations on the front line. As I mentioned, they're trying to keep people alive. They're trying to get them basic health care, get them clean water, and hopefully an education. And many of you in the room that may have had some experience with the refugee crisis know that we're failing miserably even in those basic life-saving food, medicine, shelter categories. And so advocacy, especially for right to work, is taking a back burner to many of these humanitarian organizations' day-to-day activities. The second reason that makes advocacy really difficult in this space is that the audience, so if we think about national governments, these are the countries on the front lines, these are the countries receiving those millions and millions, tens of millions of refugees. It turns out that refugees and the internally displaced are not priority citizens in their eyes. So we're talking about poor countries. Most of them are ostensibly democratic, and they need to respond to their own citizens' requests for access to infrastructure, access to healthcare. And so when a humanitarian aid organization might advocate for, you need to be providing these services to these refugees coming in, you need to be allowing them to work, allowing them to engage in your economy, they're saying, we can't even do this for our own citizens, so you can't tell us that we need to be doing it for illegal aliens coming across the border. The third big challenge is there's no leverage for humanitarian aid organizations on the ground. So if you think of, how many of you will do some more audience engagement since it's late in the day? How many of you have ever signed a petition for something in your home country that you were passionate about? Trying to change your, okay, right? We're politically engaged people. And we know that when advocacy organizations in the United States and European countries and advanced democracies are advocating, they use 2 levers to try to get policymakers to change their mind. The first is votes. They say, we want you to change the policy in this way, and look, the masses and your voters care about this, and they're gonna vote you out of office, right, if you don't vote this way. That's the lever of votes. The other is money, right? We know companies have power, investment companies, traditional corporates can come to the government and say, look, we need this. It's going to mean major jobs. It's going to have a major economic impact on your state, on your province, whatever. And they can shape public policy with that lever. But when we look at a humanitarian aid organization on the front lines of the refugee crisis, they don't have votes, right? They're not voting citizens. They're usually international expats. The people they're speaking on behalf of don't have votes, right? They're illegal immigrants or they're refugees in the country, and they don't have a say. So they don't have that lever. And while they're, to a lay person, maybe significant amounts of money, in the world of capital, we see very, very small amounts of money going into the refugee crisis, right? And we know that, we've heard that on a number of panels, right? The gap between the need and the capital currently available is massive. So we don't have that lever. And so what you see is these humanitarian aid organizations, just even if they try to push and try to get political, they don't have that lever of power. In addition, they're often serving in a way at the mercy of the host government. And so if they get too political, they can get kicked out. We've seen this with MSF in Burma and Sudan. And so if they get kicked out, they can't do their life-saving mission. So they don't go there. And then the final 2 points I'll just touch on briefly is capacity and if there's corruption. So sometimes we see it is not humanitarian aid organizations advocating for the right to work and pressuring governments, but it's the other way around. Local authorities are pressing NGOs on the ground for concessions. I saw this in the field in Mae Sot, in the refugee camps from Burma into Thailand. NGOs were trying to do their work. They were trying to advocate for the rights of refugees. And the response by local authorities was, take the tires off your SUVs or we're not letting you in. We're not gonna let you bring your food shipments in. And so if you have local authorities pressuring NGOs in that way, you know, your advocacy environment is not very friendly for the NGOs to be pressing for concessions from the local authorities. And in some cases, we have host governments that do want to do the best by refugees and internally displaced people. They want to help them, but they simply don't have the capacity. I saw this in Colombia. There was a local mayor in one of the paramilitary controlled areas. And he said, you know, there's these NGOs coming to me saying, you know, you need to provide for these displaced people that are coming out of the jungle. You need to be providing them with school. He said, I don't even have enough money for my own citizens. How can you be saying that I need to provide for these citizens? I don't have the money. And so that is why advocacy has failed for the past 60 years.
Now, just to be a tiny bit optimistic here for a second, aren't there a couple cases where it's worked?
Well, this is where it works. And so in the book, I argue that we can use all of the excellent ideas and brain power in this room along with the capital in this room, right? Just in the way that we know corporations can use money as a lever for policy change, we can have impact investors using their money alongside of, you're not going to only be empowering refugees directly by investing in refugee entrepreneurs, but you're also going to be using that lever to encourage host governments to see these people as an asset to the economy rather than a threat. And when that's done, then we can see some policy change.
But not a lot.
Well, there's a lot happening. So I think in a moment, we're going to be hearing about some innovative social impact bonds that have been being done in this space. Kiva has a World Refugee Fund. They've raised over $7 million investing in refugee entrepreneurs. There's a new fund being developed that's seeking to raise $40 million for microfinance in refugee entrepreneurs. And so we're seeing a lot in this space where the investment community has, because of the attention, both because the Pope has focused on how important the refugee crisis is, because of the media coverage of people washing up on the shores of Greece and the shores of Europe, we're finally seeing a focus much more broadly outside the humanitarian community, seeing that we need to do something about this.
But to put you on a spot, sort of given your research, you know, if I or Beth had $10 and or 10 units of outrage at the injustice taking place, you probably wouldn't put any of those units into advocacy. You'd put them into other solutions, or would you actually say that we should be investing some of our time and outrage and money in advocacy as a solution, or is it really just so hard that generally speaking you would say we need to find other ways?
I think that they have to be hand in hand. And what we've seen is if you're only investing and you're not trying to shape the policy side, you could set up a situation where refugees are worse off. So what we see is refugees are working, for example, I've seen this, I was interviewing a brother actually working in Little Somalia in Nairobi. And if you work a day's work and then you get on the bus as a Somali refugee in Nairobi, you can get shaken down by the local authorities and they take all of your hard-earned money. So it's really important that we get this policy piece fixed along with the investing piece. We can only really empower and support refugee entrepreneurs if they're legally allowed to do that work. And so I think that $10 would be well spent in advocacy coupled with investment.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit then about some of your ideas around investment and kind of the direct mobilization of capital. You in the book basically saying that microfinance is a potential solution, or crowd-funded conditional grant pools. Say a little bit more about why you think those are good solutions.
Sure. Well, when I was first working on the solution piece of this book, I was really interested in the Kiva model. And so I thought, this is how the outraged individual can do something when it feels like the governments of the world are failing to do something. Thankfully, Kiva decided to do that, so that was great. That was their own idea. This is like an idea whose time has come, because when the book came out, I started seeing all over the place, there's major thought leaders that are saying the same thing. Private sector needs to get engaged in the refugee crisis. So that I saw microfinance as a way that regular people could get engaged in the game. And then over the past 2 years, we've been working with all different types of organizations, UN, UNHCR, investors, traditional nonprofits, looking at how does the private sector get involved, right? So we see investors, many of them don't know the reality of the refugee crisis on the ground. We have humanitarian aid organizations that don't know the language of business. And so what we've found in a number of summits that we've organized is that there are some broken pieces along the links that need to be connected. And so that's what the Refugee Investment Network's trying to connect those links, to try to help bring together the deals, get them polished and grown in a way and presented in a way that investors feel ready and comfortable to invest, and developing deals along the continuum that we've talked about many times today, right? From more grant making, which is in a way like without a return that the Kiva model is doing, all the way to fully market returning initiatives and big deals that larger institutional money can get involved in the game.
Say a little bit more about the types of investment opportunities or business opportunities that exist, and kind of coming back to this insight that some of these camps are there for generations, or at least for 20 or 30 years. What are the kinds of things that one might find as an investor, and maybe more importantly, what are the kinds of businesses in these camps that can create jobs and some sort of opportunity for these people?
Sure, and just like we're talking about how there's this continuum of different risk and return models, there's also this need of continuum from really small micro investment to very large investment. So on the micro side, we see those stories all of the time. They're often highlighted in the press, and in every refugee camp and internal displacement camp I was in, you see amazing innovation and entrepreneurship. So these people are fleeing. They may have lost all their money and they may have lost all their worldly possessions, but they haven't lost their skills, right? If they were a mechanic over there, they're a mechanic over here. Just because they've crossed an international border doesn't mean they've lost their skill set. And so we see people start up ice cream shops, hair salons, restaurants in the refugee camps and in the cities that are hosting them. And so on the micro side, the big investors could invest in a microfinance fund, and so those are being developed. On the larger side, this is where there needs to be some collective impact or collaboration around developing the deals. So an example would be when we gathered for a solution summit in London last summer, the World Food Program said, we are buying micronutrient-rich paste, and it's being made halfway around the world. We're flying it in. Think about the carbon footprint. And we're not hiring anybody here, and we're not helping the Syrian refugees that are right here in Jordan. And so we began a conversation about how do we bring the World Food Program in as a committed buyer who's buying millions and millions of dollars of this product every year? How do we bring in the UN to help on the advocacy side to get the Jordanian government aligned and supportive? And then how do we develop the for-profit market deal and present it to investors in a way that it all aligns and everyone is getting their goal met, and locals are getting jobs, both refugees and Jordanians? That's a piece that we might want to touch on as well. It's very important. And then also we're just doing something from a climate change perspective that's also smart. We're making products right here locally and selling them right here locally rather than shipping them around the world.
I'm going to be sensitive to time, but now that you've been somewhat optimistic, let me bring you back to the pessimism. You listed 5 pretty significant challenges to these individuals who are, in these rough situations, ever emerging from them. It seems like the investment piece could be relevant, but as long as there is this lack of leverage, the lack of policy, the corruption, the lack of capacity, are we really going to ever see a significant increase in the quality of life for the displaced people?
I think we are, and this is why. So all of those advocacy challenges that I talked about are challenges for the humanitarian aid organizations on the front line and the UN agencies. Those entities simply don't have the leverage to change policy. But the money in this room does, and that's why we're seeing impact investors step up. So many of you may have heard George Soros has committed $500 million in investing in refugee entrepreneurs. That kind of money can change policy and then can directly impact the lives of refugees.
All right, so what are there are a couple of pieces of advice that you would give to individuals that want to get engaged as an investor or as a supporter, perhaps an advocate? What more could we do if we were compelled that this is in fact a massive crisis, which it is?
Definitely. I would really encourage them to talk with others that have been kind of walking this walk for the past 2 years. So if you go to the deep dive tomorrow, you'll hear a bit about the Refugee Investment Network. They're trying to bring together investors across the continuum together so each type of investor can find the right kind of deal for their risk return profile. What we found is, even though George Soros and his organization made this major commitment 2 years ago, they've been struggling to find the big, simple deals. We heard about that on the last panel, right? There's not a lot of just $50 million deals easy to drop your capital into. And so there's a real need for collaborative work, for blended models. And so I think I would encourage them to go to the deep dive tomorrow. We're going to hear from a couple more panelists just after this that are also options to get involved.
And since we started high level, kind of went down, let me bring it back up high level to the issue at hand, which is based on what you're seeing and your sense of what's happening in the geopolitical world. Do we have any real hope in the next 5 or 10 years that the 68 million is going to come down? Or is your suspicion that, in fact, because of the way that the world is going, that this number is going to go up and this problem is going to be an even bigger one for us to solve?
I think all indicators, unfortunately, suggest it's going to go up. So in my book, I'm only talking about internally displaced and refugees from forced to leave their homelands due to violence. But we know that due to climate change and oceans rising and catastrophic weather events, that number is even larger. And we know from the economic fallout of climate change that number of migrants is even going to be larger. So if you take the larger pool of numbers of migrants, in addition to refugees, that number is going to continue going up. And so so we know that number is going to get worse. And I think we can ask ourselves, do we think our governments are going to solve that problem? And with the rise of anti-immigrant and anti-refugee governments in many of the European and American and in the US, I don't think that solution is going to come from government. And so it's going to have to be the private sector that steps up, because we've just demonstrated that the humanitarian aid organizations cannot do it alone.
Well, I think we're going to end with that and say, Thane, we're going to give you 2 extra minutes so you can get some solutions on the table. Please join me in thanking Christine.